It began with a smell, metallic, raw, and unnatural. Not the scent of death exactly, but of something much older, more ancient. Like history itself was bleeding. A crowd had gathered pressed together in frozen silence beneath the pale light of an overcast morning. Their breath curled in ribbons above their heads. Snow clung to the edges of stone buildings, muffling the world, as if the earth itself was trying to forget what was about to happen. At the center of it all, a wooden scaffold stood its grain, darkened by cold dew and the memory of blood. Beside it, rising like the mast of a ship gone mad, was the stake. 12 feet tall, sharpened to a point. Waiting. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cold, maybe Romania or Austria, drop your time zone in the comments. I'd love to know where you are in this moment. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By the late 1700s, Europe believed itself civilized. The Enlightenment had swept through courts and academies like a polished wind, extinguishing the torchlight of medieval cruelty, or so it liked to claim. Yet, in one corner of the continent, where empires overlapped and peasants still bowed to boots, something old was stirring. Impalement, by all accounts, should have been extinct. A punishment from the dark annals of ancient Assyria, famously revived in Wallachia by a certain prince named Vlad, and then outlawed across Europe as unfit for modern justice. But in 1785, it returned. Not in secret, not in the shadows, but on a raised platform witnessed by hundreds and authorized by the most powerful dynasty in Central Europe, the Habsburgs. The victim or subject, depending on how you see it, was a man named Horea. But we'll come to him. First, you must understand what impalement meant in this context. This wasn't mere death. It wasn't execution for expedience. It was theater. Punishment crafted not only to kill, but to echo, to mark history, to make the body into a lesson. Historically, impalement was used sparingly and with purpose. In the Ottoman world, it was a public ritual performed with frightening efficiency. Victims were sometimes anesthetized with opium, not out of kindness, but for spectacle, to keep them alive longer, to allow their slow death to linger across hours. In other places, the method was cruder, less refined, but no less horrifying. And yet by the time this last execution took place, such punishment had been absent from European courts for generations. The Holy Roman Empire, for all its cruelty, had opted for more civilized techniques, hanging, beheading, sometimes quartering, but always with a veneer of legal formality. So why bring back this? That question alone has haunted historians. Was it desperation, an overreaction, or a deliberate symbolic gesture? Because this wasn't a rogue act by a local warlord. It was imperial decree, endorsed, sanctioned, staged. And it's worth noting this wasn't the Middle Ages. This was 1785. The same decade Mozart performed in Vienna. The same century Voltaire wrote about reason and tolerance. In London, they debated Parliament. In Paris, revolution simmered. But here on the fringe of empire, they raised a stake. Here's a quirky historical footnote. While impalement was making its horrific return in Eastern Europe, elsewhere in the Habsburg realm, the Empress Maria Theresa had just banned witch trials and promoted smallpox vaccinations. The contrast is almost surreal: needles of mercy in Vienna and stakes of vengeance in Transylvania. Historians still argue whether the execution itself was truly by impalement, or whether later accounts exaggerated it to mythic proportions. The records are ambiguous. Some mention a stake, others a sharp pole. Some speak of quartering. Others, more poetic, describe a slow ascent into death. Truth and terror often share a language. But we do know this: it was public. It was meant to be terrifying. and it was the last of its kind. Why does that matter? Because history rarely offers lasts with clarity. The last duel, the last beheading, the last plague pit, most pass without recognition. But this was documented, whispered about, passed down through stories and local songs. A final breath of medieval justice in a supposedly enlightened age. It's easy to dismiss impalement as something other cultures did, barbaric methods from Ottoman lands, or punishments reserved for far-off kingdoms. But the truth is colder. Europe never outgrew cruelty. It just got better at dressing it up. That's the dread of this story, not just the act, but the decision to bring it back. To resurrect an ancient horror and place it proudly in the center of the square. A performance of power, blood, and silence. And at the heart of it stood Horea. His real name was Vasile Ursu Nicola, but history prefers legends. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a noble. He owned no land, commanded no army, at least not in the beginning. He was a carpenter. An ordinary man in an extraordinary place, crushed by centuries of class feudalism and ethnic tension. Transylvania in the 18th century was not the fantasy realm painted in Gothic novels. It was a pressure cooker of injustice. Romanian peasants like Horea were second-class citizens in their own homeland. The land belonged to Hungarian nobles. The laws were written in Latin, and the taxes bled families dry. It wasn't just poverty. It was systemic humiliation. A world where your name meant nothing, and your suffering was tradition. But Horea had a voice. And when he spoke, people listened. This much is clear: he wasn't just a rebel. He was a symbol, a peasant prophet in a sheepskin coat rallying the broken with words sharper than any blade. What followed would become one of the bloodiest uprisings in Romanian history. But before the fires, before the betrayal, and before the stake was sharpened, there was a spark. And his name was Horea. Before he was a martyr, before he was a myth, Horea was just a man. Born in 1731, in a small village nestled in the Apuseni mountains of Transylvania, Vasile Ursu, Nicola came into a world already bruised by hierarchy. He was baptized Romanian, which meant in the eyes of imperial law that he was born inferior. That label, etched into official records and whispered in courts, would follow him for life. But there was something in his presence, something that disturbed even those above him. Horea wasn't educated in the formal sense. He couldn't read Latin statutes or quote the philosophers of Vienna. But he knew how to build things, with wood, with stone, and later, with words. As a skilled carpenter, he traveled between villages, working, listening, and absorbing the stories of oppression that repeated like an old song. And unlike most peasants, he refused to bend completely. He spoke clearly, forcefully, with a confidence that unsettled the nobles who heard him speak on behalf of others. Soon, he was summoned twice to Vienna itself, carrying petitions from fellow villagers directly to the imperial court. Few commoners ever set foot in those halls, let alone dared to bring grievances before the empress. Maria Theresa may not have remembered his name, but the bureaucracy did. Historians still debate whether Horea's visits had any real effect. Some argue they were symbolic, a way for the empire to appear receptive without actually changing anything. Others suggest Horea's voice carried weight, that his words influenced subtle reforms later enacted. What no one doubts is that his actions planted seeds, and seeds given time break through stone. By the early 1780s, tension in Transylvania had reached a slow boil. The triune union of the Hungarian nobility, Saxon merchants, and secular warriors ensured that land law and religion remained in the hands of the few. The Romanians, who made up over half the population, had no political representation, no right to own land, and no protection under ecclesiastical privilege. They were expected to serve pay and remain quiet. They didn't. In 1784, a strange wind swept through the mountain villages. The whispers grew louder. Horea had returned, And this time he was not alone. With him was Ion Warga, known to history as Cloșca, calm, strategic, and fiercely loyal. And under them, hundreds of peasants began to organize not as scattered mobs, but as a force. They weren't calling for revolution in the French sense. They weren't declaring independence or imagining utopias. Their demands were specific, painful, and pointed end the forced labor. Stop the tax farming. Let them own the land they worked. And above all, treat them as human beings. The empire had underestimated them. In early November, the uprising began. What started as a protest quickly turned into something else. Villages rose up like sparks in dry grass. Manor houses burned. Nobles fled in carriages, leaving behind silks and silver. Documents were seized. Titles destroyed. Fields trampled. One noblewoman later wrote that she watched her husband try to reason with the peasants, only to be stripped of his clothes and paraded through the streets. She survived by hiding in a flour bin covered in dust and fear. Others were not so lucky. It's important here to step carefully. The rebellion, like all such movements, was not clean. There were acts of justice and acts of vengeance. Some landlords were merely evicted. Others were executed publicly, crudely, with the same tools used to till the soil. There were instances of looting, of indiscriminate violence, and of mercy. Historians are divided on the scale of the brutality. Some say the rebels acted with relative restraint. Others, particularly early chroniclers sympathetic to the nobles, painted the uprising as an orgy of savagery. One report described a cellar filled with decapitated heads, though its accuracy has long been questioned. What's clearer is the scale of the response. Within weeks, the rebellion had engulfed large swaths of central and western Transylvania. Over 150 noble estates were attacked. Dozens of towns were seized. The countryside trembled, and everywhere they went, the peasants followed a voice. Horea did not call himself king. He did not claim divine right. But in village after village, he was welcomed like a prophet. Sometimes he arrived on horseback, other times on foot, walking among the people, like a man carrying the burden of their pain. He spoke not of revenge, but of justice, of a world where men were not cattle. Cloșca coordinated the logistics. He directed groups to strategic locations, ensured supplies moved, and helped discipline fighters. Between them, they brought shape to something that might have otherwise collapsed into chaos. And yet chaos came anyway, because beyond the borders of the revolt, the empire stirred. Emperor Joseph II, son of Maria Theresa, had inherited a complex web of ambition and inertia. He fancied himself a reformer, rational, modern progressive, but he also ruled a patchwork empire held together by fear and tradition. When he learned of the rebellion, he hesitated. This delay would become infamous. Instead of sending immediate military aid, Joseph tried to contain the situation with half measures. He issued vague promises of reform. He dispatched envoys. But he did not crush the rebellion, at least not yet. Why? Some believe he secretly sympathized with the peasants. Others suggest he feared overreaction would spark more revolts elsewhere. Still, others point to his obsession with central control. He didn't want to act without full command of the narrative. Whatever the reason, his inaction gave the rebels time, but not victory. As winter crept over the mountains, supplies dwindled. The nobles regrouped. And in Vienna, the patience wore thin. One imperial counselor reportedly said, "This cannot stand. Not just for Transylvania, but for every subject watching." The decision was made. The rebellion would be crushed, and its leaders made examples of. It's worth noting one odd detail here. While the empire was planning counterinsurgency, Horea issued something unusual, a ceasefire order. He reportedly told his men to avoid further bloodshed. Some obeyed. Others, lost in rage or frostbite, did not. This final contradiction, restraint amid rebellion, would later color how Horea was remembered. As a villain to some, a martyr to others, and a mystery to many. But none of that would save him. Because even legends can be betrayed. Snow fell like a judgment. It coated the rooftops of burned villages, softened the jagged edges of shattered windows, and turned blood-stained soil into slush. The mountain stood silent as if watching the rebellion exhale its final breath. By December of 1784, the peasant uprising had begun to fracture. Starvation was setting in. Ammunition ran low. But more than that, the initial wave of purpose, the righteousness of revolt, had been smothered beneath something colder. Reprisal. Imperial forces had arrived at last, marching under banners that no longer inspired awe, but dread. These weren't diplomats or reformers. These were soldiers armed with orders extinguish the rebellion and make examples of its leaders. What followed was not a battle, but a sweep. The Habsburgs, known for their bureaucracy, suddenly became frighteningly efficient. Towns were reclaimed, survivors interrogated, suspects hanged. The countryside became a theater of forced silence. And then came the betrayal. It didn't happen on a battlefield. It didn't involve swords or smoke. It happened in the way betrayals often do, quietly, in the space between hunger and fear. On December 27th, 1784, Horea and Cloșca were captured near the village of Scorța. They had taken shelter in a forest cabin, trusting someone they shouldn't have. Their captor, a local shepherd, was offered a reward, gold coins, and imperial favor, and he accepted. Whether he regretted it afterward is not recorded. Their arrest was swift. Imperial guards moved in under cover of darkness. There was no fight, no last stand, only frost breath and the sudden weight of chains. The peasants who had once sung Horea's name now hid in silence. To speak of him was to invite suspicion. To remember him aloud was to risk death. They were taken to Alba Iulia, the ancient capital of Transylvania, a city whose stone walls had witnessed centuries of blood and ceremony. There they were locked in separate cells beneath the citadel, watched day and night. The trials, if they can be called that, began in January. Officially, Horea and Cloșca were charged with high treason incitement to rebellion and the murder of imperial subjects. But the verdict was never in doubt. The point of the process wasn't to determine guilt, it was to perform authority. To transform two peasants into living proof that the empire remained unshaken. One curious fact, despite the gravity of the charges, no imperial law specifically prescribed impalement. The punishment had been unofficially retired for over a century. The law called for hanging, beheading, or in extreme cases drawing and quartering. So why this? Historians still argue whether the decision came from Vienna or from regional authorities eager to assert dominance. Some documents suggest Emperor Joseph II himself wanted a more modern sentence, but others imply the military commanders on the ground took liberty with interpretation, perhaps driven by rage, fear, or a darker desire to make a memory that would last. There was also the matter of precedence. The last recorded impalement in Western Europe had occurred in the 1600s. In the East, under Ottoman rule, the method persisted longer, but never with such public display under imperial Christian law. In effect, Horea and Cloșca would be the last, and the empire wanted everyone to see it. They were sentenced on February 26, 1785. The judgment was read aloud in Latin, the language of old power. The method was described plainly: death by impalement upon an iron stake to be carried out in the central square of Alba Iulia. Cloșca is said to have listened without flinching. Horea, ever composed, reportedly bowed his head. Neither spoke. In the days that followed, rumors spread faster than frostbite. Some claimed the execution would be done in stages, that the stake would be heated, or that salt would be rubbed into wounds. Others said a priest had begged for clemency and been denied. One bizarre account insisted the executioner had refused the job and had to be replaced by a criminal offered his own life in exchange. While these tales remain debated, one detail is confirmed: hundreds were summoned to witness it. Nobles, soldiers, clergy, even school children. Carriages arrived from nearby towns, inns filled, Markets were closed. It was to be both punishment and pageant. Imperial justice, after all, was not just about order. It was about optics. On the eve of the execution, guards recorded that both men were offered confession. Horea declined. Cloșca prayed silently, clutching a wooden cross fashioned from a broken fence post. Neither asked for mercy. One forgotten anecdote: the imperial cooks were instructed to prepare roast pork and mulled wine for the officers attending the spectacle. The order, written in a ledger still preserved in the regional archives, reads like parody feasting on one side of the square, horror on the other. And so the stage was set. It's easy to imagine the morning of February 28, 1785, as gray and silent. But according to some accounts, the crowd buzzed with unease. Children cried. Soldiers whispered behind gloved hands. The stake had been driven into the ground the night before. Its iron point glinted in the weak sun. The execution began at dawn. And yet this is where the records diverge. Some say the stake was not driven into the body in the traditional sense, that instead the men were bound upon it and hoisted to die from exposure and humiliation. Others insist the impalement was real, but hastened mercifully shortened to avoid lingering torment. One Austrian officer noted that the method was foreign to our hands, suggesting unfamiliarity with its mechanics. A handful of Romanian sources passed down orally claim the punishment was never carried out in full, that the execution was interrupted, that someone in the crowd wept that the bodies were taken down early. These stories, dismissed by most scholars, still echo in the hills. Whatever the truth, one detail is consistent: both men died, slowly, publicly, and when it was over, the stake stood empty, a monument to pain. Later that day, soldiers removed the remains. No grave was marked, no ceremony held. Their bodies were taken beyond the city to an unmarked pit where earth and snow did the rest. But something lingered. In the silence that followed, the people did not forget. They just stopped speaking, at least aloud. In whispers, songs, and winter firesides, a question began to smolder. If this is how the empire treats its poorest, what does it fear the most? The city of Vienna, ornate, candlelit, humming, with the sound of harpsichords and powdered conversation, seemed a universe away from the frozen execution yard of Alba Iulia. And yet it was there, within those opulent walls, that the fate of Horea and Cloșca had ultimately been sealed. In 1784, the imperial court of Joseph II sat atop a fragile empire. The Habsburg lands stretched from the North Sea to the Balkans, a sprawling patchwork of languages, religions, and resentments. Transylvania was but one of many frontiers, but it was the one where fire had taken root. At the time of the uprising, Joseph II was lauded by Enlightenment thinkers. He was at least on paper a reformist. He had abolished serfdom. He had promoted religious tolerance. He had even spoken of lifting burdens on the peasantry. But all reforms, when filtered through the machinery of empire, become tangled in contradiction. Historians still debate whether Joseph II truly knew what had been done in his name. Some argue he ordered the punishment, directly furious that his reforms had been interpreted as a license for rebellion. Others suggest he was misled by advisors who feared appearing weak before the nobility. A few claim he tried to stop it too late, too carefully, too cautiously. What is certain is that Vienna watched and waited. The early reports from Transylvania were vague. Descriptions of unrest, isolated attacks, temporary disorder. But by the time the names Horea and Cloșca reached the imperial desk, the rebellion was no longer viewed as an outburst. It was an infection. And the empire, like any organism under threat, responded with immune violence. One obscure detail, often overlooked during the height of the rebellion: Joseph's court hosted a masquerade ball celebrating the empress's birthday. Diplomats danced beneath chandeliers, while emissaries from Transylvania delivered petitions soaked in wax and fear. The contrast is absurd and telling. Even within Vienna, there was division. Some ministers urged caution, pointing to the peasants' grievances as legitimate. Others, particularly from the Hungarian and Austrian aristocracy, demanded blood. They saw in Horea not a man, but a warning one, that if left unanswered could spark revolts from Galicia to Bohemia. So the court hesitated. The army, meanwhile, did not. Generals deployed to Transylvania were not scholars of Rousseau. They were veterans of border wars and siegecraft men more familiar with sabers than statutes. To them, a rebellion was not a negotiation, it was a mutiny. And when word returned that Horea had been captured and that the peasants were scattering, the question wasn't how to restore order. It was how to remind everyone what order looked like. Punishments, after all, are messages. And in 18th century Europe, where printed newspapers barely reached the frontiers, punishment was still best delivered by example, one that lived in the memory, one that whispered to every village, "This is the price of forgetting your place." There's a curious letter buried in the imperial archives, written by a low-ranking official who attended the execution. In it, he described the spectacle not with horror, but with admiration. It was done cleanly, he wrote, efficiently, like pruning a dangerous limb. He even praised the organization of the crowd, noting that the people remained quiet, though many cried. It's hard to know what's more chilling, that such an event occurred, or that it could be described in the language of gardening. But back in Vienna, the tone was different. After the execution, Emperor Joseph reportedly entered a period of reflection. Some say he became withdrawn, melancholy. Others argue the opposite, that he doubled down, suppressing further unrest with more laws, more bureaucracy, more control. In one of his final edicts, Joseph II ordered the dissolution of numerous monasteries and reduced the power of the Catholic Church. A progressive move, perhaps, but one that enraged the clergy and deepened the empire's fractures. The connection? Historians disagree. Was it guilt? Was it distraction? Or simply the inevitable unraveling of a ruler who tried to steer an ancient empire into the modern world, while dragging 1,000 contradictions behind him? One thing is clear: shortly after the deaths of Horea and Cloșca, Joseph began touring his territories, a gesture of penance, of control, perhaps both. He rode through villages where the memory of the rebellion lingered like smoke greeted in silence by peasants who bowed but did not smile. Anecdotes from this tour are sparse, but one in particular stands out. In a village near Brad, the emperor reportedly asked a boy if he knew who Horea was. The boy nodded. "He was a man," he said. "A man who talked like a priest but worked like us." It's a small phrase, innocent even. But to a ruler obsessed with unity, it would have rung like a bell, because even in death Horea's voice had not been silenced. One more tidbit, rarely mentioned: the execution of Horea and Cloșca was never repeated. Not in Transylvania, not anywhere in the Habsburg realm. No stake was raised again under imperial decree. Whether out of shame or shock or shifting politics, the method vanished into history's margins, leaving behind only that cold February morning as its final act. Was it the horror of the act itself? The backlash? Or did the empire realize too late that in trying to kill a symbol, it had carved one in stone? As the 1780s drew to a close, revolutions stirred elsewhere. France, Poland, the Americas. Across Europe, monarchies trembled, and in a quiet corner of the empire, peasants still told stories. Around stoves in fields and under breath. Not of politics, not of Vienna, but of two men, a carpenter, a comrade, and the day the empire brought back a forgotten horror. To silence a future it could not stop. The frost hadn't lifted. In the dim gray dawn of Alba, Julia carts creaked under the weight of timber iron and unspoken dread. The town square, usually a place of commerce and gossip, was transformed into a stage. But there would be no applause, no music, only the rhythm of boots on stone and the rustle of 1,000 spectators holding their breath. The sentence had been confirmed, the preparations completed. All that remained was to carry it out. Capture for Horea and Cloșca had been swift, their trial swift still. But the days between the sentence and the execution dragged like centuries. Time stretches differently when the body knows it is marked for death, and the empire made sure they had time to understand what was coming. Horea had once stood tall among his people, a peasant prophet in a sheepskin cloak. Now he sat chained ankle and wrist in a cold stone cell beneath the fortress. Cloșca was kept nearby. Neither was permitted to speak with the other. There is no record of their last words to each other. No final embrace. Only a growing silence broken by the shuffle of guards and the clink of keys. A peculiar detail. Days before the execution, a team of craftsmen was brought in from outside the region to construct the scaffold, not from the local population. The Habsburgs didn't trust the people of Alba Iulia to build what would carry the message of imperial terror, and so foreign hands hammered the wood that would hold the final warning. The iron stakes, meanwhile, had been forged by military blacksmiths, hardened, sharpened, transported under guard. These were not relics dug from medieval dungeons. They were newly made, designed for this moment. This was not a return to old methods out of desperation. This was choice. Historians still argue what exactly the method entailed. Some believe Horea and Cloșca were impaled in the Ottoman style, the stake inserted and the body hoisted. Others insist the empire used a symbolic form binding the men to stakes, rather than through them allowing exposure and exhaustion to do the work. There is even a fringe theory that suggests the word impalement in records may have been a translation error, an exaggeration by later chroniclers eager to frame the empire as barbaric. But the most widely accepted account remains grim. On the morning of February 28, 1785, the men were led from their cells, bound tightly, cloaks removed, hair disheveled, both barefoot. It is said the silence of the crowd was unnatural. No shouting, no wailing, just the dull sound of breath in the cold. Children had been made to watch. That was no accident. Generations would remember this not just in books, but in their bodies. The empire was not merely punishing rebels. It was educating its citizens. As Horea approached the scaffold, a witness noted that he looked not at the stake, but at the sky. The ritual unfolded with calculated cruelty. Cloșca was made to witness Horea's death first, not out of order, but by design. The message was clear: watch and understand. Accounts differ on how long it took. One chronicle describes the death as prolonged beyond mercy. Another claims the executioners erred, striking too deep, too fast, causing death within minutes. A third version passed down in local oral tradition insists Horea never screamed, that he stared forward unflinching until the light left his eyes. The records grow blurrier with Cloșca's end. Perhaps by then the crowd had turned away. Perhaps the scribes stopped writing. One soldier reportedly vomited. Another claimed he would never sleep without hearing the sound of bones creaking beneath iron. When it was over, the bodies were not immediately removed. They were left on display for the remainder of the day, stark against the pale sky, a tableau of finality and of failure. Because here lies the twist. In trying to erase a rebellion, the empire carved it into legend. Within days, versions of the event began to diverge. Some claimed Horea's eyes remained open after death. Others said the snow refused to settle on the blood-soaked stake. A few whispered that birds gathered on the rooftops, silent as if mourning. None of this is verifiable, but all of it persisted. There's a peculiar document buried in a regional parish archive that records a baptism in the week following the execution. The child was named Horea. The priest initially refused, but the parents insisted. The name, they said, belonged not to a man, but to a truth. The empire, sensing the resonance, moved quickly. Edicts were issued forbidding the singing of certain peasant songs. A list of banned names circulated among teachers. Even among the nobility, there was discomfort. Some whispered that the punishment had gone too far, that the image of iron-piercing flesh might one day return not as a deterrent, but as a call to arms. It's easy to dismiss such fears as paranoia, and yet, in the decades that followed, Transylvania remained restive. Small protests, smuggled pamphlets, stories told in the old dialects, always returning to him. To them, the men who had dared to speak. One final note often overlooked: no executioner was ever officially named. In imperial records, the task is marked simply as completed. No signature, no testimony, as if the act itself had become too monstrous to own. Or perhaps, as some scholars have suggested, the man who carried it out vanished, paid, protected, silenced. A ghost made necessary by the machinery of empire, then discarded when his hands became too stained to hide. And what of the stake? No trace remains. The scaffold was dismantled within days, the iron taken, the wood burned or buried. But locals claim even now that in the spring nothing grows where the stake once stood. A superstition, of course, but history is often shaped by the soil where blood was spilled. And in that frozen square beneath the ruins of Alba Iulia's fortress, the memory does not rest. It watches. There are moments when a society doesn't just punish a man, it turns him into a message. And on February 28, 1785, in the heart of Alba Iulia, the message was, "This even the earth will remember what we did here." The iron stake had been set deep into the frozen ground days earlier, but on the morning of the execution, it stood like a blade against the sky, silent, unmoving, and infinitely patient. By imperial design, the punishment was not swift. No clean beheading, no firing squad. This was performance, ritual, spectacle. And every element had been arranged to echo long after the screams had stopped. The town square had been transformed. Wooden barricades lined the perimeter, not to protect the crowd, but to frame the stage. Soldiers lined the walkways, each instructed to face forward, to show no emotion, to remain still. The clergy stood to one side, the magistrates on another, and in between them a sea of faces, peasants, artisans, children, all pressed together under the weight of shared horror. Horea and Cloșca were brought out separately, bound, barefoot, stripped of rank and dignity. They did not resist. One man in the crowd later wrote in his journal that Horea's face held no fear. Whether that was truth or idealized memory, we may never know. But something in his posture, the way he walked head high toward the scaffold, remains fixed in the historical record. Cloșca followed minutes later. A quieter figure. Fewer words. But eyes that scanned the crowd as if trying to find anyone to remember what they saw. And then, with precise, almost ceremonial timing, the execution began. Now let's be clear, impalement as a method was never about efficiency. It was about endurance. It required tools, assistance, precision. The stake had to be positioned at an angle. The body had to be arranged in a specific posture. Ropes, hooks, scaffolding. But here's the twist. Despite the brutality of the punishment, the empire insisted on order. The entire procedure was supervised by military officers who made notes, kept timing, and recorded the crowd's reaction. That's right, reaction reports. Documents measuring the impact on morale, on obedience, on public fear. The execution wasn't just about punishment. It was data collection. One such report, filed days later, noted a curious detail. Among the youth, expressions of shock were evident, among the elderly, tears. But all remained silent. The objective was achieved. Historians still argue about that phrase, "the objective was achieved." Was it obedience or fear or the death of a dangerous idea? One forgotten fact: a day before the execution, all local taverns were ordered closed. Not to prevent celebration, but to prevent courage. Alcohol might loosen tongues. And on that day, silence was the most useful sound the empire could enforce. As for the actual deaths, some accounts, as noted earlier, describe a rapid decline. Others suggest something far more prolonged. One French traveler who claimed to have seen the execution wrote decades later that he watched the sun move across the sky while the stake did its work. Whether poetic flourish or fact, it speaks to the impression left behind. A less poetic but more unsettling report came from a Hungarian officer stationed nearby. He wrote that the snow beneath the scaffold didn't melt, but turned pink. Frozen blood. Preserved in frost. Staring back at the empire like a stain it couldn't scrub clean. But perhaps the most haunting element came after the fact. Because once the execution ended, once Horea and Cloșca were dead, the empire didn't stop. They displayed the bodies for days. The stakes remained upright, the corpses visible from afar. Guards were posted not to protect the bodies, but to ensure no one dared remove them. The square became a place of pilgrimage, not for mourning, but for instruction. Parents brought their children. Teachers brought their pupils. Look, they said. This is what happens to those who defy the emperor. And yet a strange thing occurred. No one spat. No one cursed the corpses. No one mocked them. The people just watched. In stillness, in silence. And in that silence something shifted. Because power, for all its strength, cannot command what people feel. And despite the empire's intentions, despite the horror, the fear, the brutality, something in Horea's posture, in Cloșca's final glance, refused to die. It lingered, a hidden resistance, a memory that would ferment slowly into legacy. Years later, during a minor revolt in the Banat region, one peasant was arrested carrying a scrap of cloth embroidered with two names, Horea and Cloșca. He claimed it had been sewn by his grandmother, that it brought protection, that it reminded him that the empire could kill bodies, but not ideas. The officer who confiscated it made a note, peasant superstition. No political relevance. But superstition has teeth. In some Transylvanian villages, even today, there's a quiet tradition children are warned not to play in open fields near Alba Iulia on February 28th. The ground remembers, old women say. And not all ghosts want company. Whether that's metaphor or something darker is left to interpretation. And here's one last detail, trivial, perhaps, but chilling in its own way. After the execution, a single wooden board from the scaffold was reportedly salvaged by a local carpenter. He used it to fashion the frame of a small church altar in a nearby village. No one realized until years later when the wood began to warp strangely. Some said it split. Others claimed it bled sap that smelled of iron. The altar was eventually removed. But the church remains, empty most days, except for one in late February, when a few candles are lit. No sermons, no hymns, just a name whispered once, then lost to the echo. Horea. What happens when a body is broken, but the story refuses to die? In the days after the execution, as soldiers dismantled the scaffold and magistrates resumed their ledgers, something invisible began to spread. It didn't come with proclamations or rebellion, but with silence. The kind that settles over a people not because they are defeated, but because they are remembering. Horea and Cloșca had been destroyed physically. The stakes were gone, their bones unmarked beneath cold earth. But the empire, in its eagerness to eliminate them, had made a crucial mistake. It had made them unforgettable. Peasant rebellions were not new. They had flared up across Europe for centuries, swift, brutal, and easily erased. But this was different. This time the rebels had names, faces, words, songs. Shortly after their deaths, fragments of ballads began circulating in the mountain villages, sung softly during work, hummed beneath breath around cooking fires. They were not grand anthems, just phrases, half rhymes, the kind of lyrics that pass from mother to child. but they carried weight. One such verse translated roughly went, "He built with hands, they broke with chains, but still he walks through snow and flame." It is not recorded in any official document, but it lives still in local oral tradition, and oral tradition, as history knows too well, is a dangerous thing. Historians still argue whether Horea intended to be a martyr. Was his silence in prison the quiet of resignation, or the resolve of someone who knew that words once spoken can be twisted, but silence can haunt? One Romanian scholar, writing in the early 20th century, claimed that Horea deliberately accepted his death to plant himself in the soil of memory. A poetic idea, perhaps. But consider this: even today, in Romania, statues of Horea and Cloșca stand tall in public squares, where once their corpses hung in warning. Not bad for men who owned nothing but courage. The transformation began slowly. At first, Horea's image was simply that of a peasant hero, a man who stood up when others bowed. But over time, his story fused with national identity. By the 19th century, amid rising nationalist movements across Europe, Horea became more than a rebel, he became a symbol. In schoolbooks, his rebellion was reframed as a fight for freedom. In literature, his voice was cast as prophetic. In art, he was painted not in chains, but with open arms, surrounded by the people he had tried to lift. The empire had tried to erase him. Instead, they engraved him into the foundation of a future nation. One quirky example: during the 1848 revolutions, Romanian protesters in Transylvania reportedly carried banners that read simply, "Horea lives." No explanation, no demands, just the name. And it was enough. There's power in names. And the imperial courts knew it. After the execution, authorities issued orders discouraging the use of Horea and Cloșca as baptismal names. It didn't work. In fact, it had the opposite effect. More boys were named Horea in the following decade than in any prior. It was quiet defiance, the kind the empire couldn't see but could never stop. There are records of minor uprisings throughout the 19th century that referenced Horea's code of justice, an unwritten ethos where no man ruled another by birth and land belonged to those who worked it. These weren't formal ideologies. They were more like remembered truths passed between generations, sharpened at the edges. Even priests, many of whom had stayed silent during the rebellion, began invoking Horea during sermons, not by name, but by parable. "Beware the man who builds with clean hands," one preacher warned in 1809, "for he will not remain silent forever." But perhaps the most unusual legacy of Horea's death came not in Romania, but in Austria. In 1851, an Austrian political cartoon meant as satire depicted Emperor Franz Joseph haunted by ghosts of the past. Among them was a gaunt figure in peasant clothes, carrying a carpenter's square. No name was attached, but the implication was clear. Even in the heart of the empire, the memory had found its way in. And yet the story was never one of simple triumph, because the same legend that empowered the oppressed could also be distorted. In the 20th century, under both nationalist and communist regimes, Horea's image was reinterpreted, sometimes celebrated, sometimes manipulated. He was called a proto-socialist, a unifier, a visionary. And while these titles gave him political currency, they also risked turning a complex man into a convenient myth. One academic noted, "When we sanctify revolutionaries, we erase their humanity." And maybe that's the final twist, because in life, Horea was not perfect. He made choices. Some of his followers committed atrocities. He could be severe. He understood the weight of violence. He was a man, nothing more, nothing less. But in death, the world made him into something else, not because he asked for it, but because people needed him. They needed to believe that a peasant could rise without permission, that a voice could challenge an empire, that even in the face of iron stakes and orchestrated cruelty, dignity could endure. So they told his story, over and over, in whispers, in songs, in names carved into trees. And every time they told it, the stake lost power, until one day only the story remained. But stories like stakes don't stand untouched by time, and when centuries pass, even iron can rust. The execution of Horea and Cloșca had long been accepted as fact. It was printed in textbooks, etched in marble, whispered in folklore. But in the age of critical history, nothing escapes re-examination, especially not something so sensational, so theatrical, as impalement in the 18th century. In recent decades, historians began asking uncomfortable questions. Was it really impalement? Or was the truth lost in translation, twisted by memory, and amplified by myth? The original sentencing documents exist, but like many imperial records, they are written in Latin, legalese, dense, formulaic, and ripe for interpretation. The phrase most commonly cited is per pelum mortem subire, to suffer death by the stake. But that phrase in context could imply binding to a stake rather than impalement by it. One school of thought argues that what happened to Horea and Cloșca was not impalement at all, but breaking on the wheel, a punishment equally cruel but more commonly used by the Habsburgs. The confusion, they say, arose when later chroniclers, especially those with nationalist agendas, deliberately described the punishment in more horrific terms to highlight imperial brutality. Supporting this view is the lack of technical detail in the original records. No mention of insertion angle or duration, just death by stake. Clean, ambiguous, convenient. Another theory proposes that the sentence was symbolic impalement, that the victims were lashed upright, left to die by exposure or strangulation, and that over time the term impalement came to represent not method, but meaning, a linguistic distortion rooted in trauma. But then there are the eyewitnesses. Several contemporary accounts, letters, journals, even an officer's report describe scenes too specific to dismiss. The iron stakes, the crowd's reaction, the long, slow end. Could all of them have been misled? Or were their memories shaped by expectation, not observation? Historians still argue, and perhaps they always will. But here lies the twist within the twist. The ambiguity is part of the power. Because whether Horea was impaled in the Ottoman fashion bound and left to die, or executed by another method entirely, the psychological effect was the same. The empire wanted fear. It wanted permanence. And in that, it succeeded. Ask anyone in Alba Iulia today what happened in 1785, and they will not quote legal phrasing. They will not speak of jurisprudence or archival footnotes. They will say what has always been said. They were impaled, like animals. That perception, that visceral memory is what lives on. It becomes more curious when one considers the political timing of the event. Just 3 years after Horea's execution, the French Revolution erupted. Heads rolled in Paris. Monarchies trembled. Across Europe, the myth of royal infallibility cracked. In hindsight, the empire's decision to carry out a medieval execution in 1785 looks more like panic than justice. And history has always responded in layers. In 1980, Romanian archaeologists claimed to have discovered a burial site near Alba Iulia, believed to contain the remains of the executed rebels. The pit held bones, fractured, twisted, bearing signs of trauma. But no artifacts, no marker, nothing to definitively name the dead. Still, locals gathered at the site. Candles were lit. Someone left a sheepskin vest stitched with the word Horea in red thread. And someone else planted a stake, not iron, just wood, soft, unsharpened, a monument of sorts, not to the death but to the refusal to forget. A century from now will the story be clearer? Unlikely. History is not a photograph. It is a mirror distorted by the breath of those who need it to say something true. What is certain is this: no other execution by impalement is recorded in European history after Horea and Cloșca. No monarch, no court, no military tribunal ever attempted it again. The method that once symbolized absolute authority had become perhaps too vividly a monument to its own failure. The stake designed to silence had become a speaker, and what it said again and again was that power is not eternal, that cruelty echoes in ways no empire can control, and that somewhere, even centuries later, in the frozen breath of a February morning, someone will remember. A man, a comrade, a voice, and the day the stake rose for the last time.